You know, after Sarah died, all I wanted was to crawl into a hole so quiet you could hear the moss grow. And Havenwood, New England, was the perfect hole, mind-numbingly boring. It was great. I found a kind of peace in the predictable rhythm of my job, neutering dogs, vaccinating kittens, lancing the occasional abscess. There was a protocol for everything, an explanation. Disease A, you administer drug B, you get result C. Logic. It was the only thing holding my own frayed wires together. Science was my fortress against the absolute chaos of everything else. It was clean. It was certain. Grief is neither of those things. Sometimes, though, late at night in the small apartment above the clinic, a branch would scrape against the window pane, and I'd jolt awake, heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My hands would be shaking. I couldn't stop them. I'd press them together, but the trembling was deep inside. It would always drag me back to something stupid, something from when I was 8 years old. A goddamn owl. I'd gotten lost in the woods behind our old house, the kind of dumb shit kids do. Night fell fast. I was terrified, so I squeezed myself into a big hollow log, pulling leaves over the opening. I remember the sounds. Not crickets or frogs. It was this clicking, a wet, chitinous sound, and a low hiss, like air leaking from a tire. Then, through a crack in the log, I saw them. 2 eyes. Huge, round, and glowing with a green light that didn't seem like a reflection. They stared right at me. I screamed myself unconscious. Woke up in the morning with a massive barn owl perched on the end of the log, blinking at me in the daylight. Case closed, right? A kid's overactive imagination turning bugs into monsters and moonlight into laser beams in an owl's eyes. It was a neat, tidy explanation. I'd lived with it my whole life. My new life in Havenwood was built on that kind of tidiness. The clinic was small, the townspeople were polite enough. I'd see Sheriff Brody a couple of times a week. He was a big, comfortable-looking guy who'd stop by for a cup of my notoriously bad coffee and talk about the fishing prospects at the lake. It was normal, predictable. The loneliness was a constant, low hum in the background, but it was manageable. It was quiet. Then, one afternoon, the clinic phone rang. I picked it up. Havenwood Veterinary? Silence for a moment. Then a voice that sounded like it had been dredged up from the bottom of a well. A dry, scraping sound, like stones being dragged over concrete. Dr. Grant? Speaking. This is Pembroke. Elspeth Pembroke. The name meant nothing to me. One of my babies. He isn't well. I grabbed a notepad. Okay, Mrs. Pembroke, can you describe the symptoms? Another pause. He's still. The address she gave me was at the far edge of town, Blackwood Lane, right up against the edge of the Havenwood Forest. I got in my truck and drove. The paved road gave way to gravel, and the quaint New England houses were replaced by tangled woods that crowded the path. Her house wasn't a house. It was a relic, a 2-story Victorian thing that was slowly surrendering to gravity and time. The paint was gone, leaving skeletal gray wood. The porch sagged in the middle like a tired old man, and several windows on the second floor were dark, gaping holes. It looked like it had been abandoned for 50 years. I knocked on the heavy oak door. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of protesting wood, the door swung inward. An old woman stood there, a silhouette against the gloom of the interior. And then the smell hit me. Damp earth, the sharp tang of ammonia, and something else underneath it. A faint, cloying sweetness, like old flowers left to rot in a vase. Mrs. Pembroke, I'm Dr. Grant. She just nodded, stepping back to let me in. My eyes took a moment to adjust. The place was cluttered with antiques shrouded in dusty white sheets, looking like a congregation of ghosts. And then I saw the cats. One was perched on the back of a wingback chair, a sleek black shape. Another sat on a mantelpiece, its tail twitching slightly. Then I saw two more on the stairs, and one peering out from under a table. My brain started a rough tally. 10, 15. Holy shit! There must have been at least 20 dozen of them. They were everywhere, on every available surface, tucked into every shadow. But it wasn't the number that made the skin on my arms prickle. It was the silence. A room with more than 20 cats should have been a symphony of noise. Meows, purrs, the soft padding of feet. There was nothing, not a sound. They didn't move toward me, didn't rub against my legs demanding attention. They just sat and watched. Their heads turned in perfect, eerie unison as I stepped further into the room. It felt wrong, like walking into a taxidermist's showroom where all the exhibits were still alive. "Which one is the patient?" I asked, my voice sounding too loud in the dead air. She pointed a thin, frail finger toward a corner. "Barnaby." I knelt down beside a large ginger tomcat lying on a threadbare rug. He was still, just as she'd said, too still. I checked his pulse. Nothing. His body was already cooling. "I'm very sorry, Mrs. Pembroke," I said gently. "He's gone." She just stared down at him, her expression unreadable. I looked around the room again, at the silent, watching audience, and that's when I noticed it. The final, impossible detail that made the bottom drop out of my stomach. They all had the same eyes. Every single one, from the black one on the chair to a fluffy white one on a bookshelf. It wasn't just the color, a piercing, luminous green. It was the quality of the light. They didn't seem to be reflecting the dim light of the room. They seemed to be generating their own. A cold, flat, chemical green. Like antifreeze. Like the glow-in-the-dark stars I had on my ceiling as a kid. My brain, my logical, scientific brain, scrambled for purchase. "Okay, Ethan, think. There's an explanation. Genetic bottleneck. Of course, it's a closed breeding colony. Severe inbreeding can fix certain traits, like eye color. Makes perfect sense. And the silence? Maybe a neurological side effect of that same inbreeding. A laryngeal issue, perhaps? Or she medicates them. Some kind of sedative in their food to keep them docile. That's it. That has to be it." My mind laid out the possibilities like sterile surgical tools, but the explanations felt thin, brittle, because another part of me, a much older part, wasn't listening to logic. It was 8 years old again, huddled in a dark log, listening to a strange, clicking hiss in the woods, staring into a pair of huge, glowing green eyes that promised a world where logic couldn't save you. You don't just stop being a vet because a house gives you the creeps. Barnaby was dead, but Mrs. Pembroke still had 24 other animals that were, technically, my patients now. So I had to go back. Twice the next week, in fact. Once for a scheduled check-in, and a second time for a calico with a weeping eye. Each visit was the same damn routine. The groaning door, the wave of that weird smell, and the silent, watching jury of green-eyed cats. The smell got to me more than anything. It wasn't just ammonia, I was sure of it now. It was layered. Underneath the sharp chemical tang was something heavy and organic. It was the smell of a damp cellar, of a freshly turned garden bed after a hard rain. It was the smell of rich, black earth. I kept looking for spilled potting soil, a tipped-over fern, anything. But the house was just dusty. There were no plants. Who the hell has a house that smells like a freshly dug grave? My logical brain, bless its stupid, stubborn heart, kept trying. Damp rot in the floorboards, that's it. Mixes with the ammonia, creates a unique olfactory profile. It sounded smart, it sounded scientific, it almost worked. Almost. On the second visit, I saw something that my brain couldn't explain away so easily. I was in the main parlor, dabbing ointment on the calico's eye. Most of the other cats were in their usual spots, statues in a dusty museum. But through the archway into what looked like a dining room, I saw one of them, a big gray tabby, hunched over something on the floor. A bird, a sparrow maybe. Okay, no big deal. Cat catches bird. Circle of life. It's what they do. I finished with the calico and stood up, ready to pack my bag. I glanced over at the tabby again. It hadn't moved, and that's when I noticed. It wasn't tearing at the bird. It wasn't plucking feathers or ripping into flesh. Its head was bent down, and it was perfectly still. It looked like it had plunged its fangs into the sparrow's neck and was just holding it there, like a kid with a juice box. I took a step closer. The movement caught the tabby's attention. It lifted its head, and the dead sparrow fell to the floor. There was no blood on the cat's mouth, none. Just two tiny, neat puncture marks on the bird's neck. The cat stared at me, its green eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Then, without a sound, it turned and padded away into the shadows. I stared at the bird. My stomach did a slow, sick roll. You're tired, Ethan. You're overworked, you're grieving, and you're seeing things. It was probably eating the head. Or you just didn't see the blood from this angle. I repeated it to myself, a mantra against the rising tide of something else. I packed my bag and got the hell out of there. Mrs. Pembroke was getting stranger too. She'd drift through the rooms like one of the ghosts in the white sheets, never quite looking me in the eye. I tried to get a medical history on the cats. Any past illnesses, vaccinations, where did they all come from? She just gave me this thin, gummy smile. They just find their way to an old woman, doctor. Lost children, all of them. They know this is a safe place. That night, I was on my couch, nursing a beer and trying to lose myself in some mindless action movie on TV. Gunshots and explosions, loud, normal. Then, during a quiet moment in the film, I heard it. A sound from right outside my living room window. A faint, wet clicking, followed by a low hiss. My blood went cold. Every muscle in my body locked up. I knew that sound. Oh God, I knew that sound. It was the sound from the log, the sound my brain had so neatly filed away as bugs for 30 years. But it wasn't coming from the deep woods. It was right there, a few feet away, on the other side of a thin pane of glass. My heart was trying to punch its way out of my chest. My hands, they were shaking again. I couldn't stop them. I pressed them together, but the trembling was deep inside. Raccoon, my brain screamed, a desperate last stand. It's a raccoon in the trash cans, or a possum. You're in the country now, you idiot. Get a grip. I forced myself to my feet. My legs felt like they were filled with sand. I walked to the window, my hand shaking so bad I could barely grab the edge of the curtain. I took a breath and pulled it back. Nothing, just the empty street bathed in the orange glow of a single streetlight. No raccoons, no possums, no monsters. Just my own reflection staring back, pale and wide-eyed. I let the curtain fall, my forehead pressed against the cool glass. Shit, I was losing it. The stress was finally making me crack. That night, I had the dream. I was 8 years old again, the rough bark of the hollow log digging into my back. The smell of damp leaves and my own fear filled the tiny space. Outside, the clicking and hissing grew louder, closer. I squeezed my eyes shut, but I couldn't block out the green glow filtering through the crack in the wood. It was getting brighter. The hissing stopped, and a voice whispered, slithering through the wood like a snake. Ethan. It wasn't a human voice. It was dry, ancient, like the scrape of bone on stone. It knew my name. The green glow filled the crack,
washing over me. The eyes weren't just looking anymore. They were getting bigger. They were coming closer. The log wasn't going to protect me. Nothing was going to protect me. I woke up with a gasp, tangled in my sheets, my t-shirt soaked through with sweat. The room was dark, silent. My heart was still jackhammering. I sat up, running a hand over my face. It was just a nightmare, an old memory twisted by a stressful week, that's all. My gaze drifted to the window. Moonlight cut a pale rectangle on the floor, and for just a second, a horrifying second, I saw a shape silhouetted against the moon, a cat, sitting perfectly still on the outside windowsill of my second-story apartment. I blinked, rubbed my eyes hard. When I looked again, it was gone. The windowsill was empty. My fortress of logic wasn't just cracking, the whole goddamn foundation was turning to sand. Fuck this. I needed a cup of coffee, a strong one, and I needed to talk to someone normal, someone who could tell me I was just being an idiot. The diner smelled like hope, or at least what passed for it in my life right now. Burnt coffee, sizzling bacon, and bleach. It was real, solid. You couldn't argue with the clatter of a fork on a ceramic plate or the low hum of the fluorescent lights. This was my anchor. I was dropping it deep into the mud of the mundane, praying it would hold against the tide that was trying to pull me under. Sheriff Brody was already there, in a booth by the window, a half-empty mug of coffee cradled in his big hands. He was a fixture in this town, solid as the granite hills surrounding it. His face was a roadmap of 50-odd years lived in one place. Creases around his eyes from smiling, a permanent furrow in his brow from worrying. He was exactly the dose of normal I needed. "Doc," he grunted as I slid into the vinyl seat opposite him. He nodded at the waitress, who was already approaching with a pot. "Sheriff," I managed to smile. It felt weak, like a muscle I hadn't used in a while. "Thanks for meeting me." "No trouble. Town's quiet. Mrs. Gable's prize-winning pumpkin got swiped off her porch, but I got a feeling a few teenagers with a bad sense of humor are the culprits. That's about as exciting as it gets around here." He took a sip of his coffee. "You look like you ain't slept." The observation was so direct, so free of pity, that it was almost a relief. "Just a rough night," I said, pouring a waterfall of cream into my black coffee, watching the color swirl and lighten. Old memories, you know. This was it, the reason I'd called him. Not to talk about Mrs. Pembroke, or the cat on my windowsill, or the clicking sound that now seemed to echo in every quiet moment. No, my logical brain wouldn't allow that. It would be professional suicide, the new town vet cracking up after a couple of weeks. Instead, I had to frame it as something else, something manageable, a joke. I took a deep breath. "It's stupid, actually," I started, trying to make my voice sound light, amused. "I was thinking about when I was a kid, grew up just on the other side of the county line, you know, near the state forest." Brody nodded, his eyes on the street outside. "Know the area." "Well, when I was about 8, I got myself properly lost in those woods. Sun went down, and I was terrified. Hid out in a hollow log, thinking every sound was some kind of monster. I forced a chuckle. It came out sounding like a cough. I was cowering in there for hours, listening to this clicking and hissing. Freaked me right out. Then I saw these 2 huge green eyes staring at me through a crack in the log, glowing. I was so scared I passed out cold." I paused, swirling the coffee in my mug, watching the little whirlpool. I needed to land the punchline, the part that made it all okay, the part that proved I wasn't losing my mind. When I woke up, sun was out, and sitting right on top of the log was this massive barn owl, just sitting there, staring at me. I looked up at Brody and gave him the biggest, most self-deprecating grin I could muster. Scared half to death by a damned bird. The clicking was probably just beetles in the wood. The glowing eyes were just moonlight. Kid logic, right? Scared of my own shadow. I waited for him to chuckle, to slap the table and tell me a story about how he'd once mistaken a scarecrow for a murderer. I needed him to laugh. I needed him to confirm that fear makes you things, that the world is a rational place where strange sounds have simple explanations. He didn't laugh. He just took a slow sip of his coffee, his brow knitting together in that familiar, thoughtful way. He lowered the mug back to the table, leaving a wet ring on the formica. The silence stretched. The sounds of the diner seemed to grow louder for a second, the sizzle of the grill, the low chatter from the counter, before they all began to fade into a dull, distant roar. Brody finally looked at me, his gaze steady. He wiped his mouth with a paper napkin, and then he spoke, his voice completely casual, just a man making an observation. "Barn owl, huh? That's funny." He paused, and my stomach twisted into a knot of cold, heavy dread. "Ain't any barn owls in this county," he said, picking up his fork. "Never have been." The words didn't hit me like a punch. They were quieter, sharper, a needle sliding between my ribs, straight into my heart. My smile, the stupid, fake, desperate smile I had plastered on my face, froze. It felt like the muscles had turned to glass and were about to shatter. The fork in my hand felt impossibly heavy. I couldn't hear the waitress asking if we wanted to order. I couldn't hear the bell on the door jingle.
All I could hear was that one sentence, playing over and over again in the sudden, vast silence of my own head. Never have been. The diner dissolved around me. My fortress, my anchor to the real world, was gone. I wasn't sitting in a booth smelling bacon. I was 8 years old again, the rough bark of the hollow log digging into my back, the smell of damp earth and my own terror filling my lungs. The sound, that wet, clicking sound. It wasn't beetles. The hiss, like air being forced through dry leaves. It wasn't the wind. And the eyes, oh God, the eyes, huge, round, and glowing with a light that didn't come from the moon, a light that came from within. They weren't just looking, they were studying me, curious, hungry. My entire life, I had stood on a foundation of one simple, comforting fact. I was scared by an owl. I built my career, my identity, my sanity on that explanation. It was the wall I built to keep the chaos out. And Sheriff Brody, with 7 simple words, had just kicked the whole goddamn thing down. If it wasn't an owl, if it wasn't a bird, then what the hell was it? What kind of creature has giant, green, glowing eyes and makes a sound like clicking bones? What kind of thing finds a lost little boy in the woods and just watches him? My mind, reeling in the dark, snagged on one last horrifying thought. A connection that lit up my brain like a flash of lightning, illuminating everything in stark, terrifying detail. Mrs. Pembroke's house. The house that always smelled like a freshly dug grave. The house right on the edge of those same woods. And her cats, all 24 of them, staring, silent. Every single one of them with the exact same luminous, impossible green eyes.